"You're going to die poor and alone in this dump," my daughter-in-law Vanessa said while standing in the middle of my tiny apartment kitchen, holding her designer handbag away from the counter like the place might stain it. My son Ethan chuckled softly beside her, not because he thought it was funny, but because disagreeing with his wife had become something he no longer knew how to do. I kept my eyes on the kettle as steam curled quietly into the air. Outside the kitchen window, rain tapped softly against the old brick building. The apartment smelled faintly like chamomile tea and furniture polish, the same scent my husband Charles used to say made every place feel like home. Vanessa looked around again with a dramatic sigh. "Seriously, Ethan, I didn't even know apartments like this still existed." Her heels clicked sharply against the linoleum floor as she walked toward the living room. One bedroom. No dishwasher. No balcony. God, she laughed under her breath. "I'd rather die." Ethan glanced at me quickly, almost apologetically, but said nothing. That silence hurt more than her words ever could. There was a time when my son would have defended me without hesitation. A time when he used to hold my hand crossing parking lots and tell people proudly that his mother was the smartest woman he knew. But that was before promotions and country club dinners, and Vanessa Whitmore entered his life wearing silk dresses and polished smiles. I poured the tea slowly into 3 cups anyway. "Chamomile," I offered gently. Vanessa looked offended by the suggestion. "No thank you," she replied. "I'm trying to avoid anything that tastes like retirement." She smiled at her own joke. Ethan finally accepted a cup, but barely touched it. The room settled into an awkward silence, heavy and uncomfortable. My apartment wasn't large, barely 700 square feet, but I kept it spotless. The bookshelves were dusted. The old oak coffee table shined under the warm lamplight. Framed photographs of Ethan as a little boy lined the walls beside faded pictures of Charles in his navy blue business suits. Vanessa picked up one of the photos and tilted her head. "Wow," she said casually. "Hard to believe you used to live in that lake house." I looked at the picture in her hand. Charles standing beside our old boat dock, smiling under the summer sun. "That was a long time ago," I said quietly. Vanessa placed the frame down with a shrug. "Well, life catches up with people eventually." She turned toward Ethan. "We should go. Reservations at 7. Ethan stood immediately, relieved to escape the tension. He set his untouched teacup onto the table and grabbed his coat. At the front door, Vanessa paused and looked back at me one last time. "You know," she said lightly, "you really should think about assisted living before things get worse." Then she smiled sweetly. "No one wants to end up old, broke, and alone." The door closed behind them. Silence returned instantly. Real silence. The kind that presses against your chest until you can hear your own heartbeat. I stood motionless in the middle of the kitchen for several seconds before walking slowly toward the mailbox slot beside the front door. Most evenings it only held grocery coupons or utility bills. But that night, there was a black envelope waiting for me. Thick paper, gold lettering, Whitmore Private Bank. I stared at it for a long moment before smiling faintly to myself. Then I locked the door, carried the envelope to the kitchen table, and whispered the first honest words I had spoken all evening. "Your father warned me this day would come." The black envelope remained unopened on my kitchen table until nearly midnight. I sat beside it with both hands wrapped around a mug of cold tea, while rain continued sliding down the apartment windows in thin silver lines. The old clock above the stove ticked softly through the silence. Tick, tick, tick. It reminded me of the grandfather clock Charles used to wind every Sunday morning in the lake house. Back then, our home had felt alive. Warm hardwood floors, fresh coffee brewing before sunrise, boats drifting quietly across the water outside our bedroom windows. Sometimes I still woke up expecting to hear Charles downstairs reading the newspaper. Grief was strange that way. It softened around the edges over time, but it never truly disappeared. I finally opened the envelope carefully, sliding out several neatly folded documents embossed with the Whitmore Private Bank seal. Beneath them sat a short handwritten note in Harold Bennett's familiar block handwriting. "Margaret, we need to speak immediately. I should have contacted you sooner, but your husband insisted the accounts remain untouched unless absolutely necessary. Please call me tomorrow morning." I leaned back slowly in my chair. Charles had always trusted Harold more than anyone. 40 years earlier, the two of them built Whitmore Marine Supply out of a single rented warehouse near the harbor in Milwaukee. I still remembered those early days clearly. Charles leaving before dawn, wearing worn denim jackets and steel-toe boots. Me balancing invoices at the kitchen table while Ethan played with toy trucks beside me. We were never born wealthy. Every dollar came from long hours and sacrifice. That was why Charles valued loyalty more than money. He used to tell Ethan that character mattered most when people thought nobody was watching. Somewhere along the way, my son forgot that lesson completely. I stared toward the bookshelf beside the window where one photograph sat slightly crooked in its frame. Ethan at 8 years old, grinning proudly beside his father after catching his very first fish at Lake Geneva. Back then, he used to hug me every night before bed without being asked. He used to bring me wildflowers from the yard and leave little handwritten notes on the refrigerator saying things like "Love you, Mom." Sometimes I wondered when exactly that little boy disappeared. Maybe it happened gradually. A business promotion here. A country club invitation there. Then came Vanessa. Beautiful. Charming. Polished in the way magazine advertisements are polished. The kind of woman who never seemed to sweat or wrinkle or spill anything on herself. At first, I truly wanted to love her. I hosted bridal showers, Sunday dinners, Thanksgiving brunches with homemade cinnamon rolls and silver candle holders polished until my fingers hurt. But Vanessa never looked comfortable around warmth. She preferred appearances, expensive restaurants, curated photographs, friendships that felt transactional. After Charles passed away from heart failure 3 years earlier, something shifted completely. Ethan stopped visiting unless Vanessa approved it. Calls became shorter. Holidays became complicated. Then one afternoon, only 6 months after the funeral, Vanessa stood inside my old lake house kitchen and casually asked whether I planned to sell the property soon, since maintaining it alone was probably unrealistic at my age. I remember how cold the room suddenly felt. At the time, I convinced myself she meant well. Looking back now, I realized that was the first moment she started calculating my expiration date. The radiator beside the window hissed softly, pulling me back into the present. I folded Harold's note carefully and returned it to the envelope. Tomorrow morning, I would call him. Tomorrow morning, I would finally learn what Charles had been trying so hard to protect. The next morning, I woke before sunrise the way I always had during my years with Charles. Old habits stayed with you long after people disappeared. The apartment was quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the occasional groan of old pipes behind the walls. I wrapped a cream-colored cardigan around my shoulders and walked barefoot into the kitchen. Outside, the rain had finally stopped. The parking lot below glistened under pale morning light. Rows of compact cars sitting silently beside cracked sidewalks and overflowing flower pots that tenants kept outside their doors. It was not a glamorous place to live, but I had never needed glamorous things to feel comfortable. I brewed coffee slowly and placed 2 cups on the table before realizing, as I still sometimes did, that there was no second person coming to join me. My hand lingered on the extra mug for a moment before I quietly returned it to the cabinet. Some loneliness arrived like a storm. Other loneliness settled in quietly and never left. At exactly 8:15, I called Harold Bennett. He answered immediately, as if he had been waiting beside the phone all night. "Margaret," he said carefully, "thank you for finally calling me." There was something unusual in his tone. Not pity. Concern. I stared out the kitchen window while he spoke. "I need you to come downtown today if possible. There are documents your husband wanted you to see personally." I hesitated. "Harold," I asked quietly, "why now?" Silence lingered briefly on the line before he answered. "Because Charles believed there would come a day when people around you would reveal who they truly were." I felt a chill move slowly through my chest. 2 hours later, I sat inside Harold's office overlooking downtown Milwaukee. Everything smelled faintly like leather furniture and old paper. The same framed degrees still hung on the walls beside photographs of Harold shaking hands with local politicians and business owners. Charles used to joke that Harold loved paperwork more than oxygen itself. Harold looked older now, his silver hair thinner, his shoulders slightly bent beneath his navy suit, but his eyes remained sharp and observant. He slid a thick folder carefully across the desk toward me. "Your husband established several protected trust accounts before he passed away," he explained calmly. "Properties, investments, commercial holdings. He placed everything under your control." I frowned slightly. "I sold the lake house after Charles died." Harold nodded. "Yes, publicly, that is what happened." He opened the folder slowly and turned it toward me. My breath caught. Inside sat ownership documents connected to apartment complexes, commercial marina properties, investment accounts, and one line that immediately made my pulse slow to a stop. Whitmore Residential Holdings, owner of Green Oaks Apartments. I blinked at the page several times before whispering softly, "That is my building." Harold gave a slow nod. "The apartment building you currently live in has belonged to your trust for nearly 18 months. I stared at him in complete silence. Downstairs, somewhere far below the office windows, traffic moved through the city streets while my entire understanding of the last 2 years quietly shifted beneath me. Harold folded his hands carefully. "Charles instructed me not to interfere unless you requested access yourself." "Why would he do that?" I asked. Harold looked at me for a long moment before answering. "Because your husband believed money hides the truth about people. He wanted you to see who would still stand beside you without it." My chest tightened painfully. Ethan's face flashed through my mind. Vanessa's laughter inside my kitchen. Thanksgiving dinners I spent alone. Missed birthdays. Unreturned calls. Every moment suddenly rearranged itself into something colder and clearer than before. Harold reached into the folder again and removed another document. "There is something else you need to know," he said quietly. "Your son has no idea how much of Whitmore Holdings legally belongs to you." For several seconds, I could not speak. I simply stared at the papers spread across Harold Bennett's desk while the city moved quietly beyond the tall office windows behind him. Cars crawled through morning traffic below like tiny silver insects. Somewhere nearby, a siren echoed faintly through downtown Milwaukee before disappearing again into the distance. The world outside continued exactly the same, while mine shifted completely beneath my feet. Harold remained patient, allowing the silence to settle naturally between us. He had always understood that life-changing truths needed room to breathe. I lowered my eyes back to the documents. Property deeds, investment statements, ownership certificates, numbers so large they barely felt real anymore. Charles had hidden everything carefully inside protected trust structures under my name. Not Ethan's, not shared family accounts. Mine. I leaned back slowly in the leather chair and whispered the only question that truly mattered. "Did Ethan ever ask about any of this?" Harold's expression darkened almost imperceptibly. "No," he answered quietly. "Not once." The disappointment inside me settled deeper than anger ever could. Ethan knew his father spent 40 years building Whitmore Marine Supply into one of the most respected commercial marina companies in Wisconsin. He knew Charles invested carefully, planned carefully, protected carefully. Yet after the funeral, my son never sat beside me and asked if I was financially secure. He never once asked whether I could afford the apartment rent. Not when my old sedan broke down last winter. Not when I stopped attending family trips because I claimed I was trying to save money. Not even when Vanessa casually joked about assisted living facilities every time she visited. Instead, they simply assumed I had become small, invisible, temporary. Harold removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose tiredly. "Charles predicted this possibility years ago," he admitted. He worried that wealth had started changing Ethan's priorities. I closed my eyes briefly. Charles noticed it too. The memory arrived immediately. 5 years earlier at our lake house dining room table, long before his heart attack, Charles sat quietly watching Ethan scroll through emails during Thanksgiving dinner while Vanessa criticized the wine selection under her breath. After they left that evening, Charles stood beside the kitchen sink drying dishes slowly and said something that unsettled me at the time. "Money does strange things to people who did not struggle for it." I remember defending Ethan instantly. I always defended him. Mothers do that even when they should not. I told Charles our son was simply stressed from work. Busy, ambitious. But deep down, maybe I already sensed the distance growing between us. Harold slid another paper toward me carefully. "There is one more issue." I looked down at the document and immediately recognized Ethan's signature near the bottom. It was a financing proposal connected to a luxury condominium development outside Chicago. Large loan amounts. Multiple investor commitments. My chest tightened slightly as I continued reading. "Ethan guaranteed this personally?" I asked. Harold nodded once. "Vanessa encouraged significant expansion over the past 2 years. Your son is leveraged far more heavily than he realizes." I understood instantly what Harold was carefully trying not to say aloud. Ethan believed his future inheritance would eventually protect him. Vanessa believed it too. Their expensive dinners, their oversized mortgage, their luxury vacations, the designer handbags, the country club memberships. They built their lives assuming Whitmore money would always catch them if they fell. But legally, none of it belonged to Ethan yet. And suddenly, for the first time in years, I understood exactly why Vanessa looked at me the way she did every time she walked into my apartment. It was never pity. It was impatience. When I left Harold Bennett's office that afternoon, downtown Milwaukee looked different to me somehow. Sharper, colder. The wind moved between the tall buildings with a whistle that carried through the streets, while people hurried past in expensive coats, clutching coffee cups and briefcases. For the first time in years, I was seeing the world clearly again. Not through grief. Not through loneliness. Certainly not through guilt. I walked slowly toward the parking garage, my low heels clicking softly against the sidewalk. Halfway down the block, I stopped outside a department store window and caught my reflection staring back at me. Gray cardigan, simple slacks, worn handbag. The kind of woman most people overlooked without a second glance. Vanessa certainly did, but Charles never had. He used to say there was power in being underestimated. At the time, I thought he meant business negotiations. Now I understood he meant life itself. My phone buzzed suddenly inside my purse. Ethan. I stared at his name on the screen for several seconds before answering. Hi, Mom, he said distractedly. In the background, I could hear dishes clattering and muffled restaurant noise. Hey, sweetheart, I replied calmly. Everything all right? Of course, I said. Why? He hesitated briefly. Vanessa thought maybe you sounded upset yesterday. I nearly smiled at the irony. Vanessa humiliates me inside my own apartment, then sends Ethan to check whether I survived it emotionally. I am perfectly fine, I answered gently. Another pause followed. Good, he said quickly. Actually, we wanted to invite you to dinner Friday night. We are hosting a small anniversary gathering at the house. There it was. Not concern. Obligation. Vanessa always remembered appearances after pushing things slightly too far. That sounds lovely, I said softly. Ethan sounded relieved immediately. Great. 7 o'clock. Before hanging up, he added casually. Try not to worry too much about things, okay? Vanessa just wants what is best for everybody. I stood motionless on the sidewalk after the call ended, surrounded by strangers rushing through the cold afternoon while my son's words replayed quietly inside my mind. Vanessa just wants what is best for everybody. No, Vanessa wanted comfort, status, control, and most of all, certainty. She wanted to know exactly where everyone stood in relation to money and power. What unsettled her was not my apartment. It was my unpredictability. Later that evening, I returned home carrying a small paper bag from the bakery downstairs. One lemon tart. Charles used to bring them home every Friday after work during our first years of marriage when we could not afford expensive restaurants. I sat quietly at the kitchen table eating small bites while dusk settled outside the apartment windows. Around 8:30, voices drifted faintly through the hallway outside my door. Vanessa's voice carried easily because she always spoke like an audience was listening. Honestly, she laughed, I do not know how she survives in there. I would lose my mind. Another woman laughed softly beside her. At least Ethan will not have to support her forever, Vanessa continued casually. Once the estate stuff eventually clears, everything finally moves forward. My fork stopped halfway to my mouth. Footsteps slowed outside my apartment door. You know what the sad part is? Vanessa added with a low laugh. She still acts like she matters. Silence settled heavily inside my apartment after their footsteps disappeared down the hallway. I placed the fork down carefully beside the plate and stared at the untouched half of the lemon tart for a very long time. Then I stood slowly, walked to the bedroom closet, and reached for the locked cedar box hidden beneath a stack of winter blankets. Inside sat Charles's old Rolex watch, our original property deeds, and a thick envelope Harold had instructed me not to open unless I was finally ready to stop pretending. The cedar box smelled faintly like old paper and Charles's cologne when I lifted the lid completely open. For a moment, I simply sat on the edge of my bed staring down at the contents while the apartment around me remained perfectly still. The old Rolex watch rested beside neatly organized documents tied together with cream-colored ribbon. Charles wore that watch every day for nearly 30 years. Even after Whitmore Marine Supply became successful enough for luxury vacations, and country club memberships. He never replaced it. He used to joke that expensive things only mattered if they survived difficult times with you. I picked up the envelope Harold mentioned years ago and carefully slid one finger beneath the seal. Inside sat a handwritten letter folded in half. My hands trembled slightly before I unfolded the paper. Margaret, if you are reading this, it means you finally stopped protecting people who no longer deserve it. I closed my eyes briefly. Even now, Charles knew exactly how to reach me. His handwriting felt steady and familiar beneath my fingertips, like hearing his voice from another room. I continued reading slowly. You spent your entire life giving people the benefit of the doubt. That kindness is one of the reasons I loved you. But kindness without boundaries becomes permission. And our son has spent too many years confusing love with access. I swallowed hard against the sudden tightness in my throat. Outside the bedroom window, evening traffic drifted softly through the city while shadows stretched across the apartment walls. The letter continued for several pages. Charles explained how he structured the trusts, why he separated ownership carefully, why he instructed Harold not to interfere unless I personally requested the information myself. Then one sentence stopped me completely. Ethan must earn trust, not inherit it blindly. I lowered the letter slowly into my lap. For years, I convinced myself Ethan's distance came from stress or marriage or adulthood itself. I defended him even when he forgot birthdays, even when holidays became inconvenient, even when Vanessa treated me like outdated furniture that no longer matched the room. But Charles had seen something much earlier than I did. He saw entitlement growing where gratitude used to live. My phone buzzed suddenly on the nightstand beside me. Vanessa. I stared at her name for several seconds before answering. Margaret, she said brightly, her tone overly cheerful in the way people sound when performing kindness instead of feeling it. Just confirming Friday night. 7 o'clock. We are doing a small dinner party for our anniversary. I remember, I replied calmly. Wonderful. I could hear music and clinking glasses in the background. Probably another expensive restaurant. And do not worry about bringing anything, she added lightly. I know things are probably tight for you right now. Tight. Such a small word for such deliberate cruelty. I glanced around my quiet apartment. The soft yellow lamp beside the sofa. Charles's framed photographs lining the shelves. The folded trust documents beside me on the bed worth more than Vanessa could imagine. That is thoughtful of you, I answered gently. Vanessa laughed softly. We just want you comfortable. Comfortable. Like I was already halfway into assisted living. After the call ended, I sat motionless for a long time before finally standing and walking toward the bedroom mirror. The woman staring back at me looked older than she once had. Grief had done that. Loneliness too. But underneath the exhaustion, something else had quietly returned to my face for the first time in years. Clarity. The next morning, I called Harold before breakfast. I am ready, I told him simply. There was a brief pause on the line before he answered quietly. Then it is time they learn who you really are. Friday evening arrived cold and clear, the kind of Wisconsin autumn night where the air smelled faintly like fallen leaves and fireplace, smoke drifting through quiet neighborhoods. I stood inside my apartment bedroom fastening a pair of pearl earrings I had not worn in nearly 2 years. They once belonged to Charles's mother, delicate and understated. The sort of jewelry that never begged for attention but always carried dignity. The woman in the mirror looked different tonight. Not younger, not richer, simply awake. I smoothed the sleeve of my navy blue dress carefully and picked up my coat from the bed. Then my eyes drifted toward the cedar box sitting open beside the nightstand. Inside rested the trust documents Harold prepared earlier that afternoon. I did not touch them. Not yet. Some truths deserved proper timing. Ethan and Vanessa's house sat inside one of the newest developments north of Milwaukee, rows of oversized modern homes lined with identical landscaping and decorative lanterns glowing beside polished driveways. The neighborhood always felt strangely quiet to me, as though everyone inside was performing success instead of living naturally. I parked slowly along the curb and sat in the car for a moment watching warm light spill from their front windows. Through the glass, I could see guests moving around holding wine glasses and laughing beneath crystal chandeliers. Expensive, beautiful, carefully curated. Vanessa opened the front door before I even reached the porch. Margaret, she said brightly, air kissing beside my cheek without actually touching me. You made it. Her eyes moved briefly over my dress and earrings. I noticed the tiny flicker of surprise she tried to hide. Vanessa valued appearances deeply enough to recognize quality when she saw it. "Come in," she said quickly. "Everyone is already here." The house smelled like catered food and expensive candles. Soft jazz played somewhere in the background while guests gathered in small polished groups throughout the living room. Ethan approached carrying a whiskey glass, smiling with visible relief when he saw me. "Mom," he said warmly, "you look nice tonight." Nice. Such a careful word. I kissed his cheek gently. "Happy anniversary, sweetheart." He smiled, but exhaustion lingered beneath his eyes in a way I had not noticed before. Dark circles, tight shoulders, stress. Harold had been right. Ethan was carrying financial pressure far heavier than he realized. Vanessa guided me toward the dining area while introducing me to several guests I vaguely recognized from previous parties. Lawyers, investors, country club acquaintances, people who spoke constantly about vacation properties and market trends while barely listening to each other's answers. One woman glanced toward me politely. "So where are you living these days, Margaret?" Before I could answer, Vanessa laughed lightly and sipped her champagne. "Oh, she downsized into a little rental apartment after Charles passed. Very simple lifestyle now." The woman offered me an awkward smile filled with immediate pity. Vanessa continued smoothly. "Honestly, I keep telling her she deserves somewhere better, but you know how stubborn she is." Several people chuckled softly. I felt Ethan shift uncomfortably beside me, but, once again, he remained silent. I simply folded my hands calmly in front of me. Across the room, I noticed one of the catering staff carrying silver trays of appetizers. Young, nervous, working hard. Charles would have spoken to them before anyone else in this room. That thought alone nearly made me smile. As dinner began, guests settled around the long dining table beneath a chandelier, so enormous it reflected in every polished wine glass like shattered light. Vanessa sat proudly beside Ethan at the head of the table while I remained halfway down near the end. At one point, conversation turned toward real estate investments and rising rental costs across Milwaukee. Vanessa laughed softly and swirled her wine. "Honestly, I cannot imagine renting at this stage of life," she said casually. "By 70, I would hope to own something more than folding furniture and a microwave." Laughter spread lightly around the table. My eyes lifted slowly toward Ethan. He stared down at his plate. And in that exact moment, something inside me finally became completely still. The laughter around the table faded slowly into an uncomfortable silence when I lifted my wine glass and set it down with deliberate care beside my plate. Crystal clinked softly beneath the chandelier light. Across from me, Vanessa still wore that polished smile she used whenever she believed she had complete control of a room. I looked at her calmly for several seconds before speaking. "Actually," I said gently, "I own the building." Nobody reacted at first. The words seemed to drift across the table without fully landing. Vanessa blinked once, then laughed lightly into her wine glass. "What building?" she asked casually. I folded my napkin carefully onto the table beside my untouched dessert plate. "Green Oaks Apartments." Silence. Real silence this time. Not polite quiet. Shock. Ethan's expression changed first. Confusion flickered across his face while several guests exchanged uncertain glances around the table. Vanessa stared at me for a moment before smiling again, though the confidence behind it had already started cracking at the edges. "Margaret," she laughed softly, "Green Oaks is owned by Whitmore Residential Holdings." "Yes," I replied calmly. "It is." Her smile disappeared completely. Ethan slowly straightened in his chair beside her. "Mom," he said carefully, "what exactly are you talking about?" Before I could answer, the front doorbell echoed faintly through the house. One of the catering staff moved quickly through the hallway to answer it, while the entire dining room remained frozen in tense silence. Seconds later, Harold Bennett stepped inside, carrying a dark leather briefcase beneath one arm. Vanessa's face drained of color instantly. Harold nodded politely toward the guests before looking directly at me. "Margaret," he said warmly, "I apologize for arriving late." The room felt smaller somehow as Harold approached the dining table. Every guest watched him carefully now. Ethan stood halfway from his chair. "Harold?" he asked, visibly confused. "What is going on?" Harold placed the leather briefcase gently onto the table and opened it with calm precision. "Your mother requested several trust and ownership documents be delivered personally this evening. Vanessa's hand tightened visibly around her wine glass. Trust documents? She repeated weakly. Harold removed a thick folder embossed with the Whitmore private bank seal and turned toward Ethan. Your father established extensive protected holdings under Margaret's sole ownership prior to his passing. Ethan stared blankly at the papers. Wait, he whispered. Mom owns Whitmore Residential? Harold gave a single nod. Along with multiple marina properties, commercial developments, and investment accounts connected to Whitmore Holdings. Around the table, guests sat motionless beneath the chandelier light. One woman quietly lowered her fork onto her plate without making a sound. Vanessa finally spoke again, though her voice sounded thinner. Now, that cannot be right. Harold calmly slid several documents across the table toward her. The ownership structures are legally binding. Ethan looked pale, truly pale, like someone slowly realizing the ground beneath him was not stable after all. I watched him carefully while memories passed quietly through my mind. The unanswered phone calls, the forgotten birthdays, Vanessa laughing in my apartment kitchen, Ethan lowering his eyes instead of defending me. All those moments suddenly sat exposed beneath bright dining room light, where nobody could pretend not to see them anymore. Vanessa stared desperately at the paperwork while her polished composure collapsed piece by piece. Margaret, she said quickly, forcing a nervous smile. If there has been some misunderstanding about finances, we never meant to make you feel uncomfortable. I almost admired how quickly cruelty transforms into politeness when money enters the room. Ethan finally looked directly at me. Mom, he whispered, why did you not tell us? I held his gaze steadily across the table. Because I wanted to know who would still love me when they believed I had nothing left. No one spoke after that. Outside, wind moved softly through the dark neighborhood, while crystal glasses reflected fractured light across the silent room. And for the first time in years, nobody at that table was looking down at me anymore. No one touched their dessert after that. The candles flickering down the center of the dining table suddenly felt too bright, exposing every uncomfortable expression in the room with painful clarity. Vanessa sat frozen beside Ethan, her fingers wrapped tightly around the stem of her wine glass, while Harold calmly returned the documents to his leather briefcase one by one. Across the table, guests avoided eye contact entirely, pretending to study napkins or silverware just to escape the tension hanging over the room. Ethan looked at me as though he no longer recognized the woman sitting in front of him. You own Green Oaks, he repeated quietly, almost to himself. You have this entire time. I nodded once. Yes. His face tightened. Then why were you living there? Such a simple question, but the answer carried years inside it. I folded my hands carefully in my lap before speaking. Because after your father died, I wanted to know whether my family still saw value in me without money attached to my name. Ethan looked away immediately. That hurt him more than anger would have. Vanessa finally found her voice again. Margaret, you cannot seriously blame us for not knowing all of this, she said quickly. You intentionally hid everything. Her tone carried desperation now instead of superiority. I studied her quietly for a moment. Even frightened, Vanessa still instinctively searched for someone else to blame. I never hid my character, I replied calmly. Only my bank accounts. Silence followed again. Ethan rubbed one hand across his face slowly, exhaustion pouring through him now that the illusion around his life had started cracking apart. Mom, he whispered, I would never have let you struggle if I knew. I believed he thought that was true. That was the tragedy of it. Ethan no longer understood that neglect does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it arrives through indifference, through postponed phone calls, through silence at the exact moment someone needs defending. I looked around the enormous dining room one last time. The imported marble countertops, the oversized chandelier, the carefully staged perfection Vanessa spent years building. Then I remembered my tiny apartment kitchen, chamomile tea cooling beside untouched cups, Vanessa laughing while Ethan stared at the floor. Suddenly, this beautiful house no longer looked impressive to me. It looked fragile. Harold cleared his throat gently. There is one final matter Margaret asked me to handle tonight. Vanessa straightened instantly, panic flickering visibly across her face. Harold removed a smaller envelope from his briefcase and placed it carefully in front of Ethan. Your mother has decided to restructure portions of the Whitmore family trust. Ethan stared down at the envelope without touching it. What does that mean? Harold answered quietly. Several holdings previously intended for direct family inheritance will instead be transferred into charitable foundations and scholarship programs under Charles and Margaret Whitmore's names. Vanessa inhaled sharply beside him. What? She whispered before she could stop herself. Harold continued calmly. Your mother believes the funds will serve greater purpose supporting veterans, small business grants, and trade school scholarships. Ethan looked stunned. Vanessa looked terrified. I met my son's eyes gently across the table. Your father spent his life building something meaningful, I said softly. I will not allow it to become a reward for people who measured my worth by whether I owned a dishwasher. Vanessa's face went completely pale. Ethan opened the envelope slowly with trembling hands while the room remained silent enough to hear paper shifting beneath his fingers. I stood carefully from my chair and reached for my coat. No one tried stopping me. At the front door, Ethan finally spoke again, his voice smaller than I had ever heard it. Mom, he whispered, please do not leave like this. I paused briefly with one hand resting against the door handle. Then I turned toward him one last time. I already left a long time ago, I said quietly. Tonight was simply the first time you noticed. Then I walked out into the cold Wisconsin night, while behind me, the perfect little world Vanessa built began falling apart in complete silence.